So our first speaker in this Faraday summer course is Professor Bob White. Bob is the director of the Faraday Institute. He's one of the founders, along with Dennis Alexander, of the Faraday Institute some 11 and a half years ago now. And it's a pleasure to have him as our first speaker this morning. Bob is Professor of Geophysics here in the University of Cambridge, where he's also a fellow of St Edmund's College. You'll find a number of books by Bob on the bookstore. As with all the books there, go and browse through them and see Rachel for your payments for those. Bob's work involves looking at the Earth's dynamic crust, a number of studies on volcanic activity. For those of you who remember the Icelandic volcano a few years ago and how that disrupted things in the UK, most of us were rather upset by that. Bob was delighted. And it's a privilege to hear him. He's done quite a number of studies on natural disasters and the responses to them. And this morning he's going to be giving a general introduction to us on the field of science and religion. So will you welcome Bob?
Well, thanks very much, and let me add my welcome to the others you've already had. I'm sorry I wasn't here last night, but it's great to see you all and to see every single chair full. No, there's one, but somebody's standing. So that's brilliant. I'm going to talk, although it's science and religion, I'm mostly going to talk about Christianity when it comes into specific religions, because that's what I know about most. But it's a general introduction anyway, so we can expand later if you wish. This is some text from a book I reviewed a while ago by Peter Atkins, an Oxford chemist. His view is that all actions, be they physical or cerebral, are purposeless, as you can see. So his conclusion from this is that this is the sound and firm foundation for the joy of true comprehension. I put this up because it seems to me unlikely that is the case if you are completely nihilistic like that. And also that people, even scientists, have some metaphysical basis on which they work. Even the most strident atheist scientist actually has some beliefs in things behind that. I think if you really believe that your whole life is completely purposeless, it seems very unlikely that that's going to give us much joy. So whether people who say this actually live out their beliefs is an interesting question. But that's what I want to investigate today, that actually we all have some metaphysical beliefs behind the way we work. But before we get into what is science and religion, obviously we have to think, well, what is science and what is religion? So let's start with what is science. And I want to put up a quote from Mark Twain. His great source of quotes is Mark Twain. There's something fascinating about science. One gets such a wholesale return of conjecture out of such a trifling investment of fact, he says. And actually, in my experience, this is true. The best piece of work I ever did was just a hunch based on a few examples, and then I extrapolated the whole world, which is what geologists do. And then people got very upset. Well, some got very excited, some got very upset about this, so they all started digging into this all over the world. And that's spawned a whole hundreds and hundreds of research projects. And that's brilliant, actually, because just a small amount of insight can give a huge amount of understanding. And I think that's how science works. So the science that you're taught at school, which is that you do an experiment, find some observations, then get a conclusion from it, it's really not the way science works. Science works from insights and conjecture and making leaps, and mostly remembering to ignore the things that don't really matter. The real trick with good scientists is knowing what matters and what doesn't matter, because no scientific theory ever works completely, but it does the main job. So I think there's a lot of insight in Mark Twain's comment. But here's another one. This is from Richard Feynman, one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century, I guess, who sadly died early. he wrote that science has organised scepticism in the reliability of expert opinion. Again, this is not the view that the public at large take. I think the public at large sort of often hold scientists up as great paragons of truth, and we must believe what they say. And some who don't like what they say will say, well, it's a conspiracy. All these scientists got together and conspired to put forward some theory, just pulling the wool over our eyes. And as Richard Feynman said, that actually science is strongly self-correcting. If there's a theory and I come up with something that is likely to shake that theory or disprove it, then I most certainly am going to publish it, because if I'm right, I'm going to make my name. If I'm wrong, then I'll sink back into the mud where I was. But Richard Feynman, of course, was the one that showed why the Challenger shuttle blew up, because there was an O-ring that had just got cold and brittle and caused that terrible disaster with many, many millions of people watching. So science is very strongly self-checking. Every paper I publish is sent out to 3 or 4 reviewers who look at it very hard and tell me what they think is wrong with it and how I should improve it. So science is a strongly self-correcting thing. So there's 2 things. It's a very creative activity. It's strongly self-checking, as it's done in our contemporary society. And the other thing that people often forget, I think, is how provisional science is. That actually the theories that we hold to now are very different from what they were even 50 years ago, let alone 100 or 150 years ago. Science is always getting better at explaining things. It's very provisional. And one of the amazing things about Einstein's laws, for instance, this was a 3-page paper that revolutionized physics. But actually, it was superseding Newtonian mechanics. But it doesn't mean to say that Newton's laws of motion, which many of us learnt at school, are wrong. They're perfectly valid as long as you're not going near the speed of light, or as long as you're not very, very massive. And they're good enough to get somebody to land on the moon. They're good enough to play billiards with. But they're not good in those extreme examples. And actually, it's clear that Einstein's laws, as he propounded them, are not the total explanation. People are always trying to get better explanations. But each successive explanation has to encompass the previous one. So science is very provisional. So that means it's a really bad idea to put your faith in science or in scientism as if it has the answers to everything, because we just know from the way it's practiced that it doesn't. It's provisional. It does a good job, we hope, in explaining things, but there's always scope for explaining things better. And if that were not the case, then we'd all be out, well, those of us who are scientists would be out of a job, of course. I just want to show you a picture I found of myself in my youth before my hair went grey, which I thought there's some resemblance, isn't, to the guy on the left, so that gave me some hope. Einstein's wife, when asked if she understood the theory of relativity, and actually she was a physicist as well, she said, "Oh no, though he has explained it to me many times, but it's not necessary to my happiness," said Einstein's wife. Well, that's another good thing to remember, isn't it? And I have to remember that when I go home in the evening. So that's just a few things about science. It's a creative activity. It's provisional. It's always looking to get better explanations. But it's self-contained. The strength of science is that it doesn't include any outside agency. So it's no good saying, well, I don't understand this bit, therefore God did this bit, because the chances are that in the future somebody's going to explain it. And there is a propensity sometimes for people to do just that. It's sort of got a name of God of the gaps. We'll put God in the bits we don't understand. But that's a really bad idea, I mean, because those gaps often get squeezed. And where does God go then? So that's not a good way of linking science to religion. What is religion? Well, I'm going to quote my colleague Dennis, who never uses one word when 5 will do. So here's his explanation of religion, his summary. It's a system of beliefs relating to transcendent realities concerning purpose and meaning in the world expressed in social practices. In other words, there's somebody out there or something out there which is bigger than us, I think you could say. although it's a bit more than that. But religion is saying, well, there's more to this world than just the physical realities we can see, although they're very real as well. Well, here's some ways that people try and relate science to religion. One is perhaps a dominant one in our culture that you'll see in the newspapers, on the news, and just often taken for granted without even thinking about it, is that science and religion are in conflict. And of course, the people that say that, usually they're scientists who say, well, science obviously is better. Science is going to win. Science has all the explanations. Though sometimes you get religious people saying, well, the answer is in this particular scripture, so anything else must be wrong, or the answer is in the way I interpret this particular scripture. So the conflict model, of course, one of the archpriests of it, I should say, is Richard Dawkins, who wrote this. He wrote, religious beliefs are irrational, religious beliefs are dumb, and dumber, super dumb. So there's not much doubt about what he thinks, is there? And actually that's, a lot of our culture says, they might not put it in those words, but just underlying it, they've not really thought about it. So yeah, science obviously has all the answers. We're so used to using mobile phones and watching television and jumping on airplanes. Science and technology have the answers to everything. But I think it only takes a moment's thought. As I said from that Peter Atkins, if science is the answer to everything, it leaves an awful lot of holes as to purpose. Obviously, science can't explain everything. I think it's obvious. Here's a cartoon I found. It's some years old now, but Stephen Hawking wrote this massively best-selling book, which is The Brief History of Time, which is said to be the most unread book on people's shelves. I don't know if you've got it. Anybody got it? Anybody read it? No. All the way through? Well done. Well, he said right at the end, if we could find the theory of everything, we would know the mind of God. But then actually some years later, and actually I know Stephen Hawking, of course, he's a Cambridge phenomenon, really. I think it's his 70th birthday, isn't it? 75th birthday, yeah, just recently, around here. This cartoon was this chap lounging in front of the TV. Stephen Hawking realised he's never going to find a single equation to explain the workings of the universe. And Stephen Hawking had come out and said that, actually. Well, his wife says, well, that's one thing you've got in common with him. So can science explain everything? So the conflict model seems to me the one that our contemporary society picks, and it sort of is perpetuated, actually, because whenever there's an interview on the BBC or radio or TV, they'll try and find somebody on one side, and they always try and be balanced and find somebody on the other side. Even if there's 99% on this side and 1% on the other side, they'll always find somebody from each side so they can have a good old ding-dong. So another one which was come up by another colleague who's a paleontologist called Stephen Gould, who died some years ago. He came up with this NOMA model, which is the non-overlapping magisteria. So he said, well, we'll do away with the problem just by saying that science and religion are dealing with totally different things. They never overlap. Just let them get on with doing their own thing. That gives a peaceful life, that's for sure. But it seems to me, again, that it's not really hitting reality, because even more so for many people in the majority world, religion is a really integral part of the way they behave in the world. I think in our strongly secular minority world, I should say now, it's hard for us to understand that sometimes, but it is the case. So the non-overlapping magisteria, things are completely separate, seems to me not to be much help to us if we're just going to keep things in completely separate boxes. And it would be pretty odd if what we did, those of us who are Christian, what we did on Sunday had no impact on what we did on Monday through Saturday. It certainly would not be consistent with the sort of Christianity that you read about in the Bible. The sort of opposite end of that, where you keep the two things so far apart they never have any interaction, is what you might call a fusion model, where you might say or scientists might say, well, science is really encompasses religion. We'll just explain away religion by neural impulses or whatever. Or the religious people who say, well, I can get all my science from the Bible, the Quran, wherever. If it's not in there, it's not science. And they then, of course, have the problem of trying to twist their interpretation to fit the reality you see around them. So the classic sort of thing in my arena is, well, my interpretation of the Bible is that the world is only 4,000, or was created in 4004 BC, therefore I've got to make all the scientific evidence for an old world fit that view. And you can come a cropper that way. So the fusion model is, I think, as bad as the completely separate magisterial model, completely separate domains model. And actually Augustine saw this way back in the 4th century. He said this, he said, it's a disgraceful and dangerous thing for an infidel, a non-Christian, to hear a Christian, presumably giving the meaning of Holy Scripture, talking nonsense on topics such as astronomy, and we should take all means to prevent such an embarrassing situation. It is embarrassing, really, I think, amongst my tribe of scientists to find who live with geological timescales, that's our bread and butter. It is embarrassing, I think, to find people ignoring the scientific evidence and saying, my reading of the Bible overrules that, so you must be wrong. Somehow we've got to hold these two pieces of evidence together. And that brings me to the 4th model, the complementary model, which it seems to most of us working in this field is the most helpful way of talking about science religion, which is to say, well, there is one reality out there, but there are different ways of looking at it, and they're all equally useful. And religious ways of looking at it are very useful, as well as scientific ways of looking at it. And somehow we have to hold these things together. Now, sometimes that might be difficult, sometimes it's easy. But unless you're going to live a schizophrenic life where you drive one off separate from the other, it seems to me this is the best way of doing it. A very common way of explaining this, and one John Polkinghorne uses, for example, is the idea of looking at the world through a pair of spectacles, looking with binocular vision. You can look through the eye of faith or through the eye of science. If you use either one just on its own, you don't get such a rich and deep view of the world as you do if you use both together. Now, you have to be a little bit careful about this because you might slip into that non-overlapping magisteria in some ways. All those previous views have some strengths in it. But to say you're looking at the world one reality with both perspectives, I think is a helpful way of thinking about it. Now, different things you look at will have different strengths and weaknesses, of course. But this sort of idea of binocular vision being much richer than just one on its own, I think is very helpful. A very classic example that people often use to explain this, which again in sort of simple terms works, is if the kettle's boiling and my wife asks me why the kettle's boiling, well, you know, being a scientist, and like many scientists, slightly on that Asperger's spectrum, you know, I might respond by saying, well, it's boiling because there's electricity coming to the element has got a resistance, so it's raising its temperature. It raises its temperature till the triple point of, or until the water is heated so much that it starts to boil and makes vapor, and there's a phase transition there from water to vapor, and that's why it's boiling. And that's a perfectly valid explanation, though my wife would not be totally impressed by that. Or I might say, well, I put the kettle on to make you a cup of tea. That's a valid explanation as well. One is more sort of a scientific physical explanation, one is more an explanation of purpose. And this is why we have to be careful with this explanation, saying this is not separating the two out in that way the NOMA model does, but both are valid ways of looking at the physical world, at why this kettle is boiling, just as one example that is often used. So there are multiple levels of and ways of looking at the world, and I don't think we should prioritize one over the other. And remembering as well that scientism, the idea that science is everything, actually is almost bound to come a cropper, to fall apart, just because science is provisional. And to put all our trust in that actually is not a very good idea. Well, I want to spend the last part of this talk talking about actual scientists and what they've believed, just as some examples. And these are all Christian scientists, as I said, because that's the domain I know. And actually, most science got going in Christian countries in the long term. There's been good scholarship to show that for good reasons, actually, which is that the Judeo-Christian view is that there is a creator God, and this is his creation around us, and we are his creatures. So it makes sense for us to look at an orderly world that he made and try and understand it. And it is quite remarkable, actually, that this created world is amenable to being understood by us. There's no a priori reason why that should be the case. And I think that's the assumption that scientists have, which is that things are consistent, they always work the same way, they worked the same way yesterday, they work the same way tomorrow, is an amazingly strong assumption. You know, you can get back to a fraction of a second of the origin of the universe in the Big Bang using physics we understand today. But it's an amazing fact that it does work like that the world is consistent like that, isn't it? There's no reason why that should be so particularly. And I think a lot of people, you know, they push that to the back of their minds, really, and don't really think about that. But of course, the Christian perspective, or the Judeo-Christian perspective, is yes, that's because it was created by a creator God who intended it to be this way, and furthermore, that he's maintaining and upholding it in this way. So the laws of physics that we talk about are maintained by him. Well, let me give you some examples over the rest of this talk of some Christians over the ages who have done this. And I want to start with the Royal Society Charter, which was given by King Charles. This is a 1663 version. And in many ways, this was when science got going as an organised activity. It's when the scientific journals got going, where people would actually publish their results and people could look at them and say, yes, that's right, or no, that doesn't work, and I'm going to change it slightly, and this is a better explanation. And it was really the key to this change was actually digging in and finding out actually how the world worked. So the motto of the Royal Society is nullius in verba, which is Latin and means don't take anyone's word for it, basically. If you want to find out how the world works, go out and look and do experiments and discover how it works. And that is a real difference from what had been done hitherto up to that point, where you tended to believe the ancients before you. If they said something, well, that was, of course, right, and you'd just think about it. And you knew a circle was the perfect geometric shape, and so therefore things must be, orbits must be, go round in circles, because that's the perfect geometric shape. Well, no, said the Royal Society, go out and look at it, see what the evidence is. And I'm bringing up this Royal Society Charter because the present-day view that science and religion are in conflict is a very recent thing. It's actually pretty well a 20th century idea in its strength. Certainly when the Royal Society was founded, this is from that charter. This is what it said. It said, the Royal Society's studies are to be applied to further promoting by the authority of experiments, as I just said, the sciences of natural things, the world around us, and of useful arts, to the glory of God the Creator and the advantage of the human race. And so a strong motivation to this group of people that first set up the Royal Society was that they wanted to understand the world around them to help humankind. By doing this, you know, we could help human, and indeed that has been the case. We've eradicated smallpox pretty well. We're within sight of eradicating leprosy and all sorts of other things. We all live longer than we used to because of scientific understanding of how the body works. And that was purposefully in their minds when they did it. And also, although you might say it was more the culture of the time, it was for the glory of God. These two things were linked together right from the very beginning. Augustine said in the 4th century, nature is what God does, or the translation from Latin is a bit tricky. It might be nature is what God is doing. But somebody who says, well, that's just nature, that's why this operates the way it does, is actually, well, if you have a strong view of the sovereignty of God, well, nature is what God does. So it doesn't sort of get you out of saying, well, that can't be God because it's just natural, if you have that strong view of it. Now, Francis Bacon, who was perhaps influential at the origins of science as they got going, he wrote this. He wrote that God must first be known from nature and afterwards recognized from doctrine, from nature by his works and from doctrine by his revealed words. In other words, his picture was that there's sort of two books of the world. There's the nature that we can see around us, we can go and look at that, but we can't know purposes, like that boiling kettle. We can't know what the purpose of that is unless we're told. If we believe there is a creator God, then we can't work out what he's like just from our own reasoning. Otherwise, we'll just invent God in our own image as a sort of bigger image of Bob White. This is what God is like. He's, of course, just like me, but bigger and better and stronger. He said if there really is a God and we want to know his purposes, then he has to reveal them to us. And of course, in the Christian perspective, at least, that's done through the person of Jesus and through the scriptures, because Jesus said, if you want to know what God is like, look at me, he said. So this idea of two books was very strong at the origins of doing science. And this particular statue of Francis Bacon, it's in Trinity College here in Cambridge. If you wander into the chapel there, I think it's great, actually. He's so worn out by all his heavy thinking. He's sitting there exhausted. So that's the two books of nature, in other words, from science and scripture. And I think people don't quite realise how strong this was, even in Darwin's Origin of Species, for instance. On the front cover, on the flyleaf opposite the title page, he wrote that you won't be able to see what it says there, so I've blown it up a bit. He actually quoted Francis Bacon, Charles Darwin did. He said, let no man think or maintain that a man can search too far or be too well studied in the book of God's word or in the book of God's works. Those two aspects, the scriptures and nature. But rather let men endeavour an endless progress or proficiency in both. So this complementary view was right there, right in the first edition of The Origin of Species. He actually removed it after about, I forget which edition. And it's a pity, actually, that he didn't go on to quote something that Bacon said a little bit beyond that passage that he's actually extracted there, because Bacon then wrote, only let men beware that they apply both to charity and not to swelling, to use and not to ostentation. Well, in the language of the time. Of course, this is exactly what I'm afraid a lot of scientists today ought to take note of, actually, because they might be very prominent scientists, but they can talk an awful lot of nonsense about some things outside their own domain. So there it was in The Origin of Species, and this is there's just hundreds and hundreds of Christians actually over the decades since then who have actually linked their faith and their science right down to Michael Faraday, from whom we took our name, one of the greatest English scientists of all time, down to people like Francis Collins, perhaps the most powerful scientist in the world, it's sometimes said. He's head of the NIH in the States, who's a very, very keen Christian person as well as having that position. And I notice he's so well respected right across the political board that President Trump has actually asked him to stay on for some time, and he is staying on in that administration while there's a transition. So many Christians, you'll also note actually it's written in Japanese at the top because I gave this talk in Japan. And one of the strengths of Christianity is it works as well in Beijing as it does in Birmingham. It works as well yesterday as it does today. Scientific theories are cross-cultural and cross-temporal, if you like, cross-time as well. And actually science has been one of the strongest links, I think, internationally. And it's why so many scientists are so upset about Brexit, actually, because there are very strong European links with many scientists. And that has been the case right from the onset of the Royal Society. when you read some of the early reports, you'll find some of those people sending a letter to their colleague in Paris by boat and actually getting an answer either the same day or the next day, even going by horse and cart and boat at the time. Well, just for a bit of fun, I want to just pick out some of the beliefs of some of these scientists across the ages. And I want to base this around 10 stamps which were issued by the Royal Society on the 350th anniversary of the founding of the Royal Society. And these were first day covers. They actually sent them off to all fellows of the Royal Society. And what they'd done is 350 years, so they chose one scientist for every 35 years to represent that progress. And when mine arrived in the post, I looked at this. They were, of course, first-class stamps. They didn't issue any second-class stamps, I have to say. When I looked at this, I thought, wow, I recognise quite a few of those people that the Royal Society picked out as very prominent Christians of their time. And I'm sure the Royal Society had no idea about that at all. That wasn't the basis on which they're chosen. But it's just interesting to go back and look at these very prominent. Royal Society thinks they were the most prominent scientists, most influential scientists for those 35 years, and see what their beliefs were. So start off with Robert Boyle, one of those early founders of the Royal Society. He was a chemist, and he was really the person that put chemistry on a professional basis rather than being the activity of alchemists, and rather smelly and dirty alchemists at that. And he wrote a very famous book called The Skeptical Chemist. And that's really set off chemistry as the professional study it is today. Very prominent in that sphere, but also he was a very active Christian. He was actually one of the richest men in Britain, well, in the UK at the time. And he wrote another book called The Christian Virtuoso, which was putting his Christian views into perspective. And of course, on the titles, they had the whole subtitles and everything, which told you what it was about, which again, you won't be able to read here, so I've blown that up. He said the purpose of this book was that by being addicted to experimental philosophy, which is what we now call science, a man is rather assisted than indisposed to be a good Christian. Right? So this was way back in the 17th century, that he thought science, you could do your science better if you're a good Christian, or at least not worse, that they both played into each other. He actually was a very good benefactor too. He was very rich, he never married, but he had a lot of estates in Ireland. He did a huge amount to help the poor in Ireland, but also translated scriptures into the local language in North America for the Algonquin Indians, and in India for the local Indians there, and did all sorts of other charitable works as well as his chemistry. I mean, incredible polymath. Isaac Newton, who of course was in Cambridge for quite a lot of his time, again, people might not realise this, but he actually wrote more words on religion than he did on science. He wrote about 4 million words on religion. And actually, if you'd asked him, as people did at the time, he saw his religious studies as much more important than dabbling in the science that he did. Now, he wasn't an Orthodox Christian, he was a Unitarian, which is quite amusing, really, because he was at Trinity College. And actually, to be a Unitarian was not a good idea. It was blasphemous at the time. I think you could strictly be put to death for it, so he didn't particularly advertise those views. But let me just show you a few to show his piety, really. He kept this notebook, and this is one from 1662, so you see he was 19 then, 19 or 20. He wrote it in his own version of shorthand, so it's in code, but actually it can be deciphered now. This was before Whitsun 1662, and it was a list of all the sins he'd committed, which again you won't be able to read there, so I'll just blow some of them up, because I suppose we might take some good ideas from stealing cherry cobs from Edward Storer, that was a sin. And then denying that he'd done so, that was another one. 20, setting my heart on money, learning, pleasure more than on God. And then 21 was a relapse. And then 22 was a relapse. 24 I like, punching my sister. Which we all do, don't we? Those of us who have sisters or brothers. And so on. He was pious, though. I mean, this, we might laugh at this, but he was serious about this. When he wrote his Principia, incidentally, this massive book of mathematics, which really changed the way people looked at the world. Do you know how many equations it had in it? Anybody know? Mathematical equations? It had actually 0 mathematical equations in Principia Mathematica, because it was all said in words in a very long-winded way. Anyway, this is what he wrote when he worked out his laws of motion. This most elegant system of the sun, planets and comets could not have arisen without the design and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. And actually Newton is a really interesting example who had this insight into his laws of physics, the laws of motion that we now learn for GCSE, I guess. And he was able to have that insight because of his profound religious views. He didn't see any problem in having God maintaining the law of gravity, for instance, because it's a ludicrous idea to think that the Earth is going around the sun and it's held there by this force called gravity, when there isn't anything connecting them. There's no piece of string between them. You know, it sounds madness, doesn't it? But he didn't think there was any problem. If God wanted to do that and hold it in its orbit, then that was fine. And so observationally he saw that it looked as if it went round, the Earth went round the sun, for instance, and there have been other people saying that. And so here was a way of doing it. We call it gravity, but actually gravity is maintained by God, was his view. And he had a little bit of a problem because the orbits actually are slightly irregular. I mean, we know from Kepler's work that they're not actually circles, they're ellipses and so on. So actually Newton in his system, people don't realise this much, I think, he had God prodding them back into position every now and then because they didn't quite work properly. But that wasn't a problem to him. And so here's, and there are actually quite a few other examples of that, where people's religious faith actually prompted their scientific leap of imagination, if you like, because that's what science is. As I said at the beginning, it's a very creative, imaginative process, and enabled them to see connections where other people hadn't. And again, it's always interesting to look at the prefaces of these books. So this was his Principia Mathematica. It had a preface by Roger Coates, who was another Cambridge person who sadly got a fever and died at age 33. So be careful when you're walking around Cambridge. You know, if you get, it's all right at the moment, but in winter it's really cold and damp and nasty. This is what Roger Coates wrote in the preface. The order of nature was established by the will of God. He must be blind who from the most wise and excellent contrivances of things cannot see the infinite wisdom and goodness of their almighty Creator, and he must be mad and senseless who refuses to acknowledge them. So this is right at the heart of some of the most profound physics that's been published. You know, it had a strong view of this being part of God's creation, part of his order. This wasn't independent of it. And as I said, the sort of 20th century secularist view that these things are completely different domains, that science, religion have nothing to do with each other, is a very recent idea in many ways. Well, there's two of them. Benjamin Franklin, next one along. Well, he lived in a culture where I suppose faith was more taken for granted. But again, very innovative scientist, as well as all the other stuff he did on the Constitution of the US and so on. In my own domain, he was ambassador to Paris in 1783 when there was a massive eruption in Iceland, which is something, as Keith said, I work on. Biggest eruption there had been for centuries, and it sent ash into the air, and much like the one from Eyjafjallajökull in 2010 that stopped all the flights, the ash came down over northwest Europe. It was the middle of the summer, and it made it really cold and damp and nasty, wet summer. And Benjamin Franklin was in Paris, and he wrote a book in the Manchester, he wrote an article in the Manchester Philosophical Journal volume 1, it just started, which being in Cambridge you can just find in the library and take off the shelf. And he said this horrible, nasty weather we're having is either due to a volcanic eruption in Iceland or due to impact of a comet. So he'd got it right at the beginning, Benjamin Franklin had. Anyway, when towards the end of his life he was dying, he wrote to his friend who was the president of Harvard, called Ezra Stiles. Along the way, one of the things he published under a pseudonym was an almanac, year by year. He had a pseudonym of Poor Richard, but actually it was Benjamin Franklin writing this. This was an aphorism he put in one of them in 1739. How many observe Christ's birthday, how few his precepts. 'Tis easier to keep holidays and commandments, he said. Towards the end of his life, people were asking about, well, what was his faith? I mean, in fact, although he was Christian, he was rather deistic. And this is what he wrote to the president of, he said Harvard just now, president of Yale, sorry. Only actually about 3 weeks before he died. He said, here is my creed, Benjamin Franklin said. I believe in one God, the creator of the universe, that he governs by his providence, that he ought to be worshipped, that the most acceptable service we render to him is doing good to his other children, that the soul of man is immortal and will be treated with justice in another life, respecting its conduct in this. This is all fairly conventional Christian stuff, isn't it? Although he was a great scientist as well. But as I said, he wasn't quite an orthodox Christian. As to Jesus of Nazareth, he wasn't quite sure about his deity. I think his system of morals and his religion, as he left them to us, is the best the world ever saw or is likely to see. But I apprehend some doubts as to his divinity, said Benjamin Franklin. Though it's a question I don't dogmatise upon, having never studied it, and think it needless to busy myself with it now when I expect soon an opportunity of knowing the truth with less trouble. So there's three, very clear Christians had made public statements of their Christian beliefs. Likewise, Charles Babbage, who's progenitor of the modern computer that we all use, the computing machine. We're coming forward in time now, so we're into the 19th century now. He was a very keen Christian, and he wrote what was called the Ninth of the Bridgewater Treaties. The Bridgewater Treaties had been published with a bequest, and there were 8 of them actually, trying to show the way that science and religion related. Charles Babbage decided to publish a 9th. He just did it himself. But this is what he said. He said, the study of the works of nature with scientific precision is a necessary and indispensable preparation to the understanding and interpreting their testimony of the wisdom and goodness of their divine author. I mean, he was very clear that actually studying nature, studying the creation, was actually studying God's works. And it was a help, at least, to understanding that divine creator as well. So that was Charles Babbage. Kepler had said a similar thing earlier on. He lived in the end of the 16th, early 17th century. I had the intention of becoming a theologian, he said, but now I see how God is, by my endeavours, also glorified in astronomy. For the heavens declare the glory of God. He saw no conflict between them either. Well, I'm not going to go through all 10. Joseph Lister invented inoculation, of course, and cleanliness generally, which helped with saving immense number of lives. He said this, he said, I have no hesitation in saying that in my opinion there is no antagonism between the religion of Jesus Christ and any fact scientifically established. Well, if you look overall from those 10, half of them were strongly religious people: Boyle, Newton, Franklin, Babbage, Lister. 2 of them I haven't talked about, Jenner and Wallace, consider themselves very spiritual. It's interesting they chose Wallace instead of Darwin for the invention or the understanding of evolutionary theory. Wallace was of much lower social standing. He was actually a collector. He actually sent a paper to Darwin which essentially was the same ideas as Darwin, and Darwin actually read it out, the Royal Society, along with his own. But when he came back to England, Wallace actually went off the rails a little bit, who had such a strong belief in the spiritual that actually started backing spiritists who were really charlatans, who were making money from pretending to be able to foretell the future and make links with dead people for vulnerable people. And there are a series of court cases where he backed these spiritists, which didn't do his reputation any good at the time, really, because they're clearly frauds. But however, he did believe in spiritual realities, although it wasn't Orthodox Christianity in those days. The last three of them, Rutherford, Hodgkin and Shackleton. Nick Shackleton on the bottom right, I knew personally. He was in my department here, died a few years ago. Was certainly a conventional secular scientist, if you like, of his time. Rutherford's great-granddaughter is Mary Rutherford Fowler. She's actually president of Darwin College now. She's on our advisory board of the Faraday Institute. And apparently Rutherford used to go around, of course he worked in the Cavendish laboratory here. When things were going well, he used to go around singing "Onward Christian," what's the word? Soldiers, that's right. Onward Christian soldiers, marching us to war. And this was great in the lab. When things weren't going so well, he used to go around singing "Fight the good fight" with all your might. So he was sort of just a conventional Christian of his times, a cultural Christian, if you like. But was not against it, but wasn't particularly for it either. So 50% were strongly religious in their faith, 20% believed in spiritual realities, and the other 30% just went along with things, really, not really opposed to religion particularly. Now, there's been a few more recent studies, and it's quite interesting to look at these 10 which were chosen by the Royal Society just for their scientific prowess, as I said, with some more recent studies. And one of them is by Elaine Eklund, who's been to Faraday several times. We might even have her book on the bookstore, do we? Yeah, we do, says Rachel. She did a survey of 2,200 American scientists, in-depth survey, recently. And these were her results, that 50% of them attended church or religious meetings regularly. 20% were spiritual. They considered that there were spiritualities, but they didn't sort of align themselves with any particular religious faith, didn't go to religious meetings. And 30% were secularist, the sort of default position we think about now. But of those, hardly any of them saw science, religion in conflict. It just wasn't of interest to them. Now, I think that's a very different picture from what you'll get from reading the popular press today, or from what people assume without sort of having thought about it, actually. So it's interesting that split of the recent survey is very similar to that split of the 10 scientists which have been chosen for their scientific prowess. There's just one other survey I want to tell you about, and then I'll stop. This was done by James Luber in 1906. It was a slightly strange questions, and you always have to worry about the exact form of the questions. And we've got somebody here, Erin, actually, who's just written a paper on what it means when you talk about people being religious. And you've got to be careful in the context you're talking about. But at least in this survey, which was in North America and conventional Christian belief systems, 42% of those people believed in a personal God. And there was a repeat survey 80 years later, and this was published in Nature, and they came up with very similar numbers, actually. They used a similar questionnaire. 40% believed in a personal God, they found. So I think that complementarist view of things is actually what's happening on the ground at the moment. And I guess that is true of many of us here as well. So just to finish, while you're in Cambridge, I don't know if you see this on the historic tour, but where the atom was, some of the first studies of splitting the atom were done in the Cavendish laboratory down in the centre of Cambridge. When Maxwell actually founded and paid for that laboratory to be built, there's these lovely doors on it, which has a quote from Psalm 111 inscribed on it. Magna opera domini esquisira in omnes voluntates eius, which I'm sure you're all very cultured and you all know what that means. But physicists aren't quite so, I have to say, generally, quite so cultured. So when the new Cavendish was built in West Cambridge, in the 60s, actually a graduate student there persuaded them to put the same quote above the new Cavendish doors, but in English, in the Coverdale translation. The works of the Lord are great, sought out of all them that have pleasure therein. So there has been a strong tradition of this link of science and faith, and in many documented cases you can see that it's people's faith, scientists' faith, that actually enabled them to make some of those leaps of imagination in their science. So I'll finish there, we can discuss that further. I always like this picture because it's nothing to do with the talk whatsoever, but it's a picture from the last journey of the space shuttle before it was retired, showing that thin blue line where all of human endeavour takes place surrounding the Earth. So everything we do is in that thin, it's a fraction of that thin blue atmosphere there. Let me stop there and take questions.
Thank you, Bob. That's for all our Faraday talks. So we had plenty of time for question and answer. We've got 30 minutes of that.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. White. In the US, they talk about, there's a quote from Peter Berger, who's a sociologist, who says that if India is the most religious country in the world and Sweden the most irreligious, then America is a land of Indians ruled by Swedes. Is that something that can be said even about the scientific establishment in UK and Europe, or?
Yes, it's very, in our culture, it's hard to find. You don't always know what the beliefs of people are, because we tend not to wear our hearts on our shoulders, as they say. But it is true. I mean, I know many, many very senior scientists in the Royal Society who are Christians. I could tell you many, many names, and they're happy for that to be known. So it's clear there are many people who are Christians. As to the population at large, I suspect the percentage of scientists who are Christian, at least, in Britain is much the same as the percentage of the general population. I'm not sure it's very much different either way, particularly. Scientists, of course, are very independent-minded people. That's how you get to do good science. You think your own thoughts. So it may be that there's... Well, I don't know what that says about science religion in their own personal beliefs. I mean, these studies that have been done and are ongoing. Elaine Eklund is now actually in the middle of doing a study of, I think, Chinese, maybe Indian as well, and some other cultures to see what the views are there as well. And you're exactly right that in places like India, it's much more, their religious beliefs are much more part of their daily experience, probably, than in our secularized world where we've sort of pushed it separate a little bit. But that doesn't mean to say that it's not real, and it doesn't mean to say that we haven't all got some metaphysical basis on which we work. So, I mean, I think it's really helpful to do these surveys and see what the reality is, because I think it is different from the public perception that we often hear. I'm not sure that's answered your question, but that if you're interested in that book by Elaine Eklund is quite interesting, and the person sitting 2 seats in front of you might be able to talk to you about, and the person sitting behind you as well, who've been doing surveys of natural disasters and looking at the responses of people to those and whether their religious faith had any impact in their resilience or their response. And so actually working out what their religious beliefs were is a necessary precursor to seeing what their responses is. So I'm sure they'd be happy to talk to you.
There's a question down here.
And at the back as well.
Thank you. There seems to be a mismatch between our contemporary culture and our history, which is what you've just been explaining. Do you think what do you think we should be trying to do to put things right?
Well, I think the Faraday Institute is one of them, actually. And Dennis and I actually founded this quite consciously outside of any divinity or theology faculties. Nearly all the other similar organisations in the world are in theology faculties, and at least my tribe of scientists would say, well, they would believe that, wouldn't they, and would ignore it. So we consciously set it up independent of those. And, you know, one of our hopes with this, Dennis is a biological scientist, I'm a physical scientist, so we sort of cover the range between us. One of our hopes is to speak to our own tribe and say, well, you don't have to throw away your brain to have faith and be a good scientist as well, basically. That this is something you should consider. It's neither irrational, nor does it make you a bad scientist, nor does it mean you've gone mad. and in a way, that's part of what we're doing. So that's one thing we can do. I think, well, Trump thinks there's false news, of course, and he's got a point insofar as I said earlier, if you ever see a debate about, I don't know, young Earth creationism or whatever really, on the radio or TV, they'll always find somebody from the two poles because they think that makes better TV, whether or not the majority of people believe one pole or the other. And there is a sense in which the two poles sort of feed off each other and keep things going. And really, I think we want to speak into that and say, you know, you can be rational, sensible, normal human beings and hold these things together. You don't have to be an extremist on either end, actually. I think one of the sad things about our contemporary world is that we are fragmenting, isn't it? We're breaking up into pieces and seeing the other as different from ourselves, and certainly seeing the coherence of science and religion is just a small part in trying to turn that back. I mean, my own sphere of age of the Earth, for instance, young Earth creationism, only really got going in the 1960s. Before that, nobody's thought there was any particular conflict between, and you know this as well because you work in this area. It's a very recent phenomenon, and I think people don't realise that, actually. So just educating people is quite important. Just say what reality is. Yeah.
With the mic, yes, across here, thank you.
Just a quick question here. You had mentioned early on that science is self-correcting.
Yeah.
And it seems to me, at least from reading about and trying to understand the current situation about global warming, that science is anything but self-correcting. It seems as though anybody that doesn't agree is either deranged or has some kind of no understanding of science at all. And I just wonder about the self-correcting side. It seems as though those who believe in, scientists who believe in global warming, think that anybody that doesn't believe their way, there is something absolutely wrong with their thinking in science.
Okay, thank you. I have written a book on global warming and the Christian response to it, which is on the bookstore. I mean, one answer is just wait and see. I mean, if global warming is occurring in the next few decades, you'll see it or not. And that is hard evidence. So that's one answer to that. I mean, my perspective is that actually global warming is happening. Now, you can then debate whether it's due to natural causes or whether it's due to human impacts, and that's a valid debate to have. You can have a debate about what the future is likely to be if we carry on, say, producing as much carbon as we do now. And that actually is quite a difficult scientific problem because there's lots of feedback mechanisms we don't understand very well. Because the Earth is now hotter than it's been for 2 million years, and so we haven't got any experience to look back on, and so it's an experiment that's happening which we don't know the outcome of. There's no doubt there's more carbon in the atmosphere now than there has been for 2 million years. There's no doubt that the average temperature is hotter than it has been for at least 400,000 years. But again, whether it's due to humans or not, I mean, I'm convinced it is due to human impacts, but people can have different views. But I think characterizing people as deranged is not the scientific method. And I don't think many of those climate scientists would be characterized by that, actually. I think they want to say, look at the evidence and let's have a discussion about the evidence. And the reason people think it's important is that some of these changes, if they are, as some of the scientists think, are passing tipping points or are irreversible, they will have a big impact on humans globally. So it is an important topic, whatever your take on it is, but your take on it should be based on the evidence, not on your sort of personal prejudice, I think, or my personal prejudice. So we can debate whether it's real or not and what the likely future impacts are likely to be, but just slagging off other people I don't think is very helpful. Actually, it doesn't really get you very far down that route, does it? And if you're saying we shouldn't do that, then I agree with you.
Thank you. So I'll hand here at the front.
Thank you for initiating a good reflection. Your reference to India kind of kindled a question in me. When we relate religion to science, should we not perhaps distinguish between, say, a religion as a belief in a personal God and religion as a belief in a, say, impersonal reality? Impersonal reality. See, when you speak about transcendental reality, should we always think in terms of, say, personal God, or also, say, God as mystery, some kind of impersonality? Because when you to India, what we find there is more impersonal kind of a belief, say, belief in Brahman, see, as the ultimate reality. So I don't know whether this aspect also has to be kind of factored in relating religion to science.
Yes, of course it does, yes. And as I said, my own expertise is in Christianity, so I haven't talked about the others, but I'd be very interested in your insights into it. I mean, that transcendent reality still has an impact perhaps on how we should behave today and how we interpret the reality around us, that it's part of how we should do that. And of course that's an important thing to do, yeah. So I'm completely with you. It's just my own expertise is not in that area, but I think people from different religious backgrounds will all have things to say into this debate. But the outcome insofar as the material world is not all there is pretty well the same across all religions, I think, unless it's a materialism religion. Yeah, so thank you.
Just wanted to ask, does the Bible ever influence your scientific endeavours? And also, why do some Christians feel threatened with scientific advances?
I don't know why Christians should ever feel threatened by science, because if you believe we live in a world that's created by God and you're studying God's creation, how can anything you find out be contrary to that? I think where people feel threatened is where they hold views which are sort of strongly personal views, and as soon as there's something that seems to be different to that, then they feel threatened. So, the classic thing is, again, I'm just speaking from my own experience, is you should interpret the first chapter of Genesis as a scientific explanation of how the world was created. Well, you can do that, but it seems to then not fit with what we actually see around us if you're a geologist. So then you have an immediate problem. And so some people feel threatened by that. I mean, I'm more inclined to say, well, some things I don't understand and I can't put them together, but I think in the case of Genesis 1, well, I think it's just a mission statement by God. It's saying, God's saying, I created the world, I chose to do it, it was a good world. And that seems to be the statement it's making, because it was written in a long pre-scientific era where people didn't think in that sort of way, and we've got to put ourselves into the mindset of the people that wrote it. So I think people shouldn't feel threatened by it particularly, but some do, and as I say, those ends feed off each other actually. Has it influenced my own activities? I mean, I think one of the things the scientific body of people worry about is fraud, because science only works if you can actually trust what people have written. Because I'm not going to reinvent Newton's laws of motion or something. Everything I do is dependent on everybody that's come before me. I mean, there's a famous quote about standing on the shoulders of giants, you know, and it's true. In my everyday work, there are people who publish things that I think are really careful scientists, and I believe what they say without having done it all again myself. There are some people that I think aren't so careful in what they do, and so I take their stuff with a pinch of salt. I don't know if other working scientists here are the same. So I think there's something about truth and reliability which is deeply ingrained in the way we do science, which is really important for it to be a coherent body, professional body. And that's why scientists are so worried about fraud, always, because that would undermine the whole process. So there is that aspect of my personal work that I have to do it with integrity, and if there's things that don't work, I have to say so, or, you know, find out why they don't work. So that sort of underpins, I think, that integrity underpins, and it underpins most scientists' work, actually. I'm not sure that's particular to my faith. Is there anything else about my own Christian faith? Well, you know, I've been a Christian for 50 years, and actually everything I do just seems to be coherent. In my science, seems to be coherent with my faith, and I'm not surprised by that, but it doesn't weaken it, it strengthens it, if anything.
Lots of hands now. Get this work around, and then I think there was one over that way.
So as a graduate student, one of my main concerns when applying for a master's or a doctorate is, does mentioning God or Christianity in our personal statements or in one of our motivations for doing science, does that diminish our credibility as scientists, and how is that seen in, for example, Cambridge and academia? Does that diminish my credibility? Am I at a disadvantage from like atheists?
Isn't that an interesting question? Yeah. I mean, science as science actually excludes all spiritual, all non-materialistic explanations. As I said earlier, just to say, well, I don't understand this, so God did it, doesn't get you anywhere, really. And I think if you had that view, that wouldn't be very helpful for getting a good academic job, because it's not what science is. Science has its own sort of rules in which it works really well. On a personal level, you know, my research group, I've always had one or two who are Christians and many who aren't. It's not a factor I consider particularly, it just works out that way. I think the important thing is to be honest in your CV, you know, and if you help run a church youth group, I think that's a bonus, actually, because it shows that you care to do things for other people and you put effort into it, and presumably you know, that's something that's important to you, and I think that's helpful in a CV, actually. So I don't know what other advice I can give. I mean, it's in Cambridge, I think it's people who are really not people of faith probably just see it, well, that's a hobby, you know, that's fine, that's your hobby. I don't think it's generally taken as a negative thing, but I don't think it's generally taken as a particularly positive thing, except insofar as it means, you know, maybe you've been volunteering in Africa for a year because you might have done it from Christian perspective to work in a hospital or whatever, but the fact you've been helping in a hospital for a year is probably a good thing, maybe in some contexts. So I think it's, yeah, that's the way it is. I think if you said it's like all things, being wise in these things, isn't it? Actually, being honest, but also wise. I mean, if they're employing you to do a scientific job, you have to be really good at doing your scientific job. That ought to be the measure that they use to judge you.
Can I add my own experience on that?
Of course, yeah.
30 years ago or more, when I was interviewed for the job I have at the moment, I put at the bottom of my CV I was a practicing Christian. And the chair of the interview panel, an atheist professor of biochemistry, said, "Does that mean you're going to try and convert me then?" To which my answer was, "I take it seriously, so yes, but I don't think you'll notice me doing it." And I got the job.
Did you convert him?
No. But we're still good colleagues and good friends.
Were you working on it?
No, I should. I mean, actually, Keith's probably too embarrassed to say this, but he works half-time for the Faraday and half-time in Southampton University, and your head of department was very supportive of you doing that, wasn't he?
Very supportive,
Yeah.
partly because he saves half my salary. It has to be said. There's a question in the middle here.
Do you think the church could be more proactive in raising the awareness of the general populace in relation to the interface between science and religion?
Yes, I certainly do. Yeah. I mean, again, I know the Church of England best, but one of the problems really is that we're being taught by people who went through their studies 20, 30 years ago, you know, when they're pastors now. And many of them came from arts subjects and so don't know much about science. But one of the interesting things, if you go to one of the big city centre churches now and you look at the student population, the vast majority, 80 or 90%, will be scientists actually, amongst the students, not the arts people. And I think it's partly because poor old arts people have been so infested by postmodernism where there's no truth anymore. It's, you know, even when an author's written something, it's not his ideas you're supposed to take from them, it's your own ideas and the way you interact with the text and so on. So actually I think they're rather at sea and rather adrift. Whereas I'd say that Christianity is looking for truth as well as science. I mean, they're both looking for truth in reality. So I think, yes, it is good to try and educate people. And Faraday's doing it in a little way, and there are other initiatives in Britain doing it. We run a course every January for ordinands. There's electives that they have to do, and we offer one of them on science and faith. And we're planning in the near future for one of the people here to be a church engagement director and actually consciously to develop programs to help. And many of us lecture on continuing education for ministers, for instance, and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think it's probably helpful for the pastors and the people coming through to actually have some understanding of this technological world in which we live, because, you know, this is the world we're living in, so we should understand it. Yeah.
Just next to you at the back there.
I had a question. One of the things you mentioned in your talk was that most science got going in Christian countries. You mentioned that, but if you look at the historical scientists, there's a lot of Arabic and Islamic and Persian philosophers and mathematicians, similarly in India. So is it more appropriate than to say most science got going in religious countries?
Yeah, well,
and then also, what's your perspective as a Christian scientist on scientists who come from other religious backgrounds today?
Well, it's how good a scientist they are. My perspective as a scientist is, can I believe the science they've done? Which is kind of independent of their personal beliefs. That's the whole point of science, actually. Yes, you're right. I mean, one of the interesting things is how maths and so on got going in Islamic countries, monotheistic countries, actually, largely, and then sort of got lost. I suppose really what I should have said more is that there was a conscious belief, at least in Britain and in the Western world, when science got professionalized, that it was being done from an understanding of living in a monotheistic culture where it was good to study creation because there was a creator behind it. But yes, of course, these other places have had strong influences as well. And I don't want to play them down, it's just I don't know much about them. But you know, there are historians of science who consciously say, well, yes, it was the prevailing Christian culture, at least in Britain, that enabled, or in the Western world at the time, that enabled Christianity to flourish in the way it did. And I don't know so well about studies in other religious countries about whether that was the case there or not. It may well have been.
I saw lots of hands and I'm missing. There we are. There's one over there, and then I think Barbara down the front here.
Thank you. I'm interested in the paradox. You started off talking about the Royal Society and the basic idea that you don't take anybody's word for it.
Yeah.
And then later on, you're talking about the importance in science of being able to trust earlier work,
Yeah.
and which is absolutely sensible. I mean, that's the only way that any sort of human culture can proceed. But it is also very close to the Christian understanding of tradition that yes, I mean, we have some, for most of us, quite limited experience of God, but to a great extent, we know God through the experience of others who have known him a lot better, and the way that we know that is true is because our limited experience doesn't contradict it.
Mm-hmm.
There it seems there's an interesting congruence here.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. Thank you for that comment. Yeah, there's a lot of commonality in the way that religious faith develops in a personal way, and the way we do science, as you say. If there's things that don't fit, then you have to generally try and work out why they don't fit.
We'll take one last question before our coffee break.
You suggested that Stephen Jay Gould wants religion and science to be completely separate. And then you said, but we can't do that. There are points where we can't. What are those points, please?
Well, things like, the kettle boiling, there's multiple explanations for that. It's the same phenomenon, but one has more of a purpose, and one is a materialistic scientific explanation. So there's two congruent views of the same thing. They're not completely separate realities. Another example that's often used is that, how I decide who I'm going to marry is certainly not a rational thing. There's a lot more going on than just sort of a list of pros and cons, although actually Charles Darwin did that before he got married. He wrote a list of pros and cons. To marry or not to marry, he said. It's still in his notebooks. And then at the end he says, QED, marry, 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 he says. But I think just holding them completely separate means we're going to live a slightly schizophrenic life, doesn't it? If my faith doesn't impact on my daily life, including the science I do and my interactions with people, it's kind of a strange faith if it's completely separate. I think that's the point I was trying to get at. And I think the non-overlapping magisterium is just actually it's a cop-out, isn't it? It's just saying that's different from that, and so we don't have to worry about it. But in reality, we're holistic people, we're whole people, and these things are part of what makes us who we are. So my faith and my science are all part of what I do. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's better to combine them than to just say they're just completely different things.
Okay, thank you. We'll take a break there. Can you join me in thanking Bob for setting the scene for us?